thanks very much. Well, again, it is again my pleasure and my privilege to thank the organizers, Ludwig, Giulio, Simone, and whoever helped out for organizing yet another great workshop. May they continue. And of course, thanks to all of you for hanging around. Greatly appreciate having come. Okay, so this is joint work with Lidia Ceriani and Conchita D'Ambrosio, and what we're trying to do here is make a modest contribution to the issue of what happens in terms of having an influence on political elections. And the title of the paper is The Concentration of Political Influence, and clearly we consider this not a good thing. If political influence is concentrated in the hands of few individuals, that certainly puts a little dent in our idea of democracy. And well, in order to get a grasp of how we can identify or measure the concentration of influence, a quick answer to that is, what is political influence? Money. We're going to have a somewhat more nuanced approach to that, but that really is the bottom line. So basically what we're looking at is wealth distributions. And typically the more we have a notion of wealth being concentrated for a set of a relatively small set of individuals, relative to the overall size of the population, the more there can be a problem, because these funds can be used, well, basically not only to support a candidate or a party, but to do so by putting a considerable amount of resources into spreading information that is clearly biased, but not only biased, and more these days it actually could better be described as misinformation. Now, and then there is clearly, I mean, if you just look at recent elections, look at what happened in the US, it's pretty clear that some individuals had no problem throwing their power and their money around, and indeed, it certainly did have an influence on the outcome. So again, what we do is, I'd like to think it's a reasonably modest exercise. We propose a way of assessing political influence concentration in terms of looking at wealth distributions. We have a proposal of dominance relation to do that. We don't have a characterization, and I'll get back to that once we get into more details. And that we don't have a characterization is, to me, not that much of a surprise, just given the nature of the beast. I'll be more precise once we have a few more formal definitions. What we will do, though, is, what we are doing, is that we try to make this, we have this proposal for a definition of measuring the concentration of political influence, and we try to link it to something that has appeared in the literature before, and maybe that way, in a way, if we want to aim that high, make a contribution to the history of thought. But I'll let you do the judge of that. So the basic idea is, we look at wealth distributions, and we ask ourselves, if we have two distributions, can we make a statement with some confidence to say that one of them is associated with more concentration of political influence in the hands of a few? As mentioned earlier, we will focus on the dominance relation, that is the quasi-ordering. But one thing I want to discuss while I'm at it, as well as to look at possible refinements, possible modifications, and see whether we can, ideally we would of course want to go a little bit further, make more comparisons if possible, and to see what the trade-offs are in terms of generating more comparability, while at the same time retaining some reasonable restrictions on how to make these comparisons. Alright, so the basic setup is one of, it's just a distributional issue, right? We focus on wealth because I think this is a more relevant variable than income in this context, because we think of wealth as the funds that are available to an individual that he or she can use to promote a candidate or a party. So the basic set of the domain of which we operate is what we call DN, and its population size or number of groups in a society. Again, we can discuss that later on, how to precisely define group membership. And we just look at rank order wealth distributions. So that's a set of all distributions in Rn plus. the origin. We often exclude the origin when we look at the relative inequality measurement. In this case, excluding the origin is fairly innocuous because if no one has anything, you don't have to worry about concentration of wealth in any way, shape, or form. And we assume that they're rank ordered. So we rank them from lowest to highest. Now, one way of looking at what happens in terms of wealth distribution is to consider, suppose let's say the richest individual. Let's say how many of the low wealth individuals would it take to match the wealth of the